Good morning and welcome to our UK Automation Forum discussion on the role of finance and greater adoption of robotics and automation. We've got with us a group of experts to have a discussion around how greater access to finance can help unlock some of the barriers to greater adoption of automation in the UK. So what I'd like to do is go around the room and allow everyone to introduce themselves, and then we'll start the discussion. So first of all, can I go to Laura?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. My name's Laura Capper, and I head up the manufacturing and construction sectors across NatWest Group.
Mike?
Good morning. My name is Mike Wilson. I'm Chief Automation Officer at the Manufacturing Technology Centre.
Oliver?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. My name is Oliver Selby. I'm Head of Sales at Fanuc UK, one of the largest provider of automation equipment globally.
Troy?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Troy Barrett. I'm the CEO of Bamic Group and Contracts Engineering Limited.
And finally, Fahim.
Morning, everyone. My name is Fahim Khan. I'm a senior economist at the manufacturers organisation Make UK. We represent manufacturing businesses in government policy.
And just to introduce myself, I'm Peter Williamson. I'm CEO at Automate UK, and we're the industry association supporting robotics, automation, industrial vision, and process and packaging machinery. So to get into the conversation, I think it would be a great idea just to kind of set the scene as to where we are in the UK at the moment in terms of adoption of automation. So I think probably this is a good one to throw out to Mike, and just kind of ask a question really. Why have UK manufacturers been reluctant to invest in robotics and automation?
I think there are a number of factors that have contributed to that. Some of it is around perceptions. A lot of businesses perceive that the technology is still quite complicated. They need skilled workforces to use the equipment. I think they also perceive that it's quite expensive, and neither of those perceptions are true anymore, by the way. I think there is a concern that maybe businesses don't have the skills. But I also think that there's a big issue around culture. Typically, UK manufacturing businesses do not adopt or do not invest in capital equipment to the same level as our competitors overseas, and robot automation is one element of that. So I think all of those factors have contributed to the fact that we're not using robot automation to the same level as our competitors overseas.
And Oliver, from your experience of providing automation into the UK industry, do you have anything you'd like to add on that?
Yeah, I think I can also add from a European experience. So I worked over in Stockholm for a number of years, and that sort of European manufacturers do tend to commit to capital expenditure programs easier than we do maybe in the UK. They also look at the way in which those capital projects are actually paid back, rather than say a year payback that we experience here in the UK as a business when we're talking to end customers. They're looking at more 3 to 5 years, and looking at, say, some of the total cost of ownership that they can actually account for with the projects they're looking at. So there's a very different culture, as Mike says, in regard the way in which projects are looked at and accounted for.
Thanks. And Troy, just obviously as a person working in the UK, but not originally from these shores, I wonder if there's anything you could add with regards to sort of the culture and why you think we are where we are in the UK with regards to automation.
Yeah, I think from my experience, Peter, there's probably at least a couple of things worth noting now, but there's certainly more to the puzzle than this. One is, for a long time, there's access to abundant, fairly low-cost labor, relatively low-cost labor. So quite a lot of businesses could focus on just hiring more people when they grew. And then two, I think countries like Europe or say South Korea that has a huge so regions like Europe and then countries like South Korea with a huge robot penetration, they often have very big domestic markets and or very big export orientated markets. And I think the UK, certainly for the past 6 or 7 years, has tried to sort of figure out, how big is this export market? What is this export market going to look like? And how big is its kind of so-called domestic market? Because the bigger the market, the more easy it is to support automation.
Okay, thanks, Troy. And I think that kind of helps set the scene a little bit as to why maybe we need to be more proactive in unlocking access to finance for these solutions. Fahim, Make UK have recently put together a report with regards to investment and access to finance in the UK, and it would be good just to get an understanding is from your report, are robotics and automation actually seen as a priority for UK manufacturers?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because in that research we found very fascinating findings. Manufacturers are actually quite open and positive about how they look at finance as a means to reach their objectives. About 7 in 10 manufacturers said they would have invested less than they did in the last 12 months if they did not have access to finance. And I think that is quite a big positive perspective for finance. And when we looked at those survey findings, and one of the questions looked at, of all the things you plan to invest in over the next 2 years, which are the most important areas you think you will need support from finance to achieve? And outside of plant and machinery, which is of course all manufacturers invest in plant and machinery, robotics and automation actually came ranked, I think, in the top 3 as kind of the most important areas that they're looking at. So I think there is a changing perception. I think all the work that people like Mike and Oliver and Troy are doing is actually starting to have an effect. And more manufacturers are now starting to think, maybe I do need a robot, maybe I do need automation, and I might need finance to achieve it. So the research findings are quite promising from what we saw in that survey.
Okay, thanks, Fahim. And I think, like you say, it's very positive that people started to look now more at greater adoption of automation. And I think the factors that we talked about as to why these things are changing is quite clear. But where are we, do you think, in terms of the current status of investment in robotics and automation in the UK? Is that something that you can expand upon, perhaps, Fahim?
Yeah. So there's research that was conducted by the International Federation of Robots that shows that the UK, out of the G7 countries, is the only country in the world that is below the world average for robotics density in terms of adoption in industry. I think we have about 101 robots per every 10,000 employees. And when you compare that to one of our biggest competitors in Germany, for example, there are about 370 robots per 10,000 employees. And if you want to go further to the east, South Korea, which ranks #1 in the world, is about 1,000 robots for every 10,000 employees. And so there is clearly, despite the changing perception, we are still behind the curve when it comes to adoption. I think that we have perhaps been slow to move up the game, and now is the time to do something about that, because it could result in a massive step change in productivity if we were able to at least even match the bottom of the top 10 of those countries. And at the moment, I think we rank about 27th. So, the state is perhaps not right now looking very good, but we are enthusiastic about where things can go.
And Laura, from your perspective as the sort of finance provider on the call, how have you seen things evolve recently with regards to businesses looking at this investment in robotics and automation?
So yeah, as Fahim said, the report that we did with Make UK shows that positivity, but I think that undeniably there's still barriers to accessing or unlocking that investment that will generate the benefits that robotics and automation can bring. And interestingly, some of the other sort of stats that came out of that whilst manufacturers recognise that those benefits, I think 60% recognise that automation boosts productivity, and a further 49% see improvements to quality. 38% of manufacturers still cite that high costs and a lack of a budget are slowing down that adoption. So that's really where I guess, leveraging finance, whether that's through loans, grants, or other funding mechanisms, helps manufacturers to then cover those initial costs without putting strain on their cash flow, and enables businesses to therefore access these advanced technologies that drive that long-term productivity and efficiency. So I think it's encouraging to see that we're moving in the right direction, but clearly there's more work to be done to unlock that opportunity. And hence why we're all on the call today, to build that awareness and build that understanding and some transparency from a funder's point of view of what we look for, which we're no doubt getting to as further on in the conversations.
Okay, thanks. And does anyone else on the panel want to add anything at this point before we move on to the next step?
So Peter, I think from our point of view, we're seeing a shift in the way in which some of these capital projects are financed, and the way in which equipment suppliers are approaching the market. So there is a drive in some areas to move towards a robotics as a service type offering, where effectively you're looking at, rather than the high capital cost up front, looking at moving it into an operational cost, an OPEX cost, which effectively, the way in which some organisations are working can be as low as effectively another head on your payroll. It's not an additional cost at the start, but obviously it's an ongoing cost. And as long as we can get the numbers to fit, that's a really good way to actually look at adopting, say, a first robot, or looking at obviously supporting seasonal fluctuations potentially where robotics can help, especially in food and beverage, for example.
And I think that raises a really interesting point, because, and kind of the next stage of our conversation is what the challenges that are facing businesses in terms of accessing finance, and also what are the challenges that the finance institutions have in terms of providing finance to companies. But clearly there are other creative ways around investing in robotics and automation without having to go down the route of traditional finance, and I think that's something that we can explore in a bit more detail as we move on through the conversation. I think what I'd like to ask now is kind of if we go back a step and ask maybe, what do we think some of the challenges are that finance institutions have faced historically in providing finance for this type of solutions, robotics and automation? And maybe, Laura, if we can ask you in terms of what those challenges have been, and then maybe we can bring everyone else in terms of starting to talk about creative ideas of how we can get over some of these challenges.
Yeah, sure. And I think, firstly, it's important to go back to basics and understand what it is that a lender looks for when assessing a funding application. So the main aspect is the affordability of that finance, which is of equal importance to both the borrower and the lender to ensure that financial long-term stability. And usually lenders will look at your historic performance as an indicator of what the business is likely to do moving forward. So if your historic performance has been a bit variable to date, then it's really important to explain that to the lender. And equally, if the purpose of your borrowing is that it will significantly improve your profitability, whether that's because you're reducing costs or increasing sales, then again, providing evidence to support this is crucial. So just relating that back to sort of robotics and automation. So if you're investing in robotics because it will reduce your operating costs because you're going to become more efficient, then knowing what those cost savings will be is key. Or if you're investing because of a confirmed new sales order and you need that equipment to help produce the products to drive that new income stream, then being really clear on what that increased profitability is and what that increase to your bottom line will do will really help the funder too. And so affordability is one side of things, but also lenders need to look at that sort of fallback position in case of that non-repayment, and that's where security plays an important role as well as matching the funding to the specific need. And that's where really I think, just following on from what Oliver was saying earlier, it's really important for equipment providers and the customer and the funder to work collectively on that side of things. So understanding the components of the robot, how it operates and how it will be used is really important. And that detailed understanding is invaluable to help with the funding application and the assessment process. So being able to provide a thorough, reliable breakdown of those costs that make up that automation or equipment or the robot. So, what is that core robot? What's the programming, the software, the fixtures, the fittings, the guards, and Oliver's probably going to tell me that I'm saying this all wrong, but those sorts of components are really essential. And being honest, where things get a little bit more tricky is where a robot's highly customized for a specific application. So if a robot is designed for a unique purpose, it could potentially limit its usefulness to a secondary user. So whereas if it's more standardized, like a sort of pick and place machine that can be applied across different industries and with different applications with some slight adjustments, that's much more attractive to a lender because there's a secondary market for that. And that becomes particularly important as well, where we're seeing multiple robots work together as a single robot on its own. If that line got decommissioned, maybe I may have little standalone value. So the lender will look at that residual value of the asset. How easy is it to be resold, and how useful is it in that secondhand market? And so therefore, the more specialised the asset, the harder it is to determine that resale value, which can make it a bit more complicated for the lender. However, as I said, you've got both components of affordability and security that are key factors in making that decision process. So even if a lender feels uncertain about the security and the residual value that robot could offer, then they're still able to potentially support the funding. And that's where, again, it comes back to the ability of the business to repay that debt due to its performance and how that asset will contribute to that performance. So how important, how integral is that asset investment to the business, and what will it deliver? And then just outside of that, I think it's useful to also just understand other factors such as, the credibility of a management team, the strength of your contracts that you have in place, the diversity of your customer base. So things like a strong contract with a major manufacturer that, especially one that's longer than the term of finance, is really key. Or that you're manufacturing a product that serves a stable and recession-proof market. These are all things that will give funder more confidence in that long-term viability of that investment. And we can look at other avenues. So it might be that you have some unencumbered assets, such as some CNC machines or some trucks, which offer greater security because of that resale market. So we could always unlock the cash as such on those assets to then invest in the robots if they're a bit more highly bespoke and it's a bit more of a trickier situation. So in summary, one size doesn't fit all, but I guess it's really important to be detailed and transparent with your lender as much as you can, and all of those factors get looked at when supporting a funding need.
Thanks, Laura. I think that spins off a couple of questions for me, and I'm going to send the first one to Mike. Laura mentioned there about automation becoming sort of more modular and easy to resell. Could you perhaps expand a little bit on maybe what technology, how technology may have evolved so that the solutions that the providers are offering maybe are a bit more attractive to the reseller?
I think it's a very fair point. Many providers these days are building relatively standard solutions with limited amount of customization for a particular client or application, which does mean then that the ability to reconfigure that is much more simpler than it used to be in the past. I also think things like the introduction of cobots, because they're much easier to program, which is really the key element of those, and the fact that they don't necessarily need the same kind of guarding packages also makes them much easier to reconfigure, redeploy either within a factory. So if some production requirements change, you can redeploy it in the same factory, or in the event that there's a serious issue with the business, it can be resold somewhere else. So the technology's moved on significantly over the last 5 years, and most of the solutions that are being sold today, particularly into the SME world, for the relatively standard applications like machine tending or welding or palletizing, those are pretty standard pieces of equipment these days and can easily be redeployed onto different products or different production lines, or even into a different business.
And I think that culturally, I think people still assume that you need to have large volume, high throughput production in order for in order to justify investments in automation. And I think that what you said there kind of confirms that that's not really the case. And Troy, obviously, we've got you on the call today because you've lived this and you're aware of these challenges. And it would be good if you could just give us a bit of a sense of your practical experience in terms of choosing the job that you looked to automate and the challenges you had in financing that particular task. Troy, are you still with us?
Yeah, I think I could make 2 points. Yep, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Peter, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you fine.
Okay. Yeah, I'd like to add 2 points to that. They kind of really tie into what the other panelists have been saying. The first is that when you're buying a new plant and equipment, traditionally you're replacing an older machine and you're getting some sort of incremental improvement. A machine is old, it's time to be replaced. You buy a new one, it's a bit more efficient. You can measure it, and it's pretty straightforward. Or you're adding capacity. Your business has had growth, or a particular area within your business, so you already know what that productivity is. So is it kind of, in terms of the company making the business case, it's pretty straightforward, and all manufacturing companies are used to replacing their traditional plant and equipment. But B, on the flip side is with robots, you're doing something within the business that's going to be a step change in productivity, meaning you're automating a process that wasn't automated. So you got to think about it differently. And often, I think it was Oliver who made the point about a 3 to 5 year payback. When you think about automating a process and the value that brings, it's hard to tie it into the same way and to use the same tools that you would for buying a new extruder, laser cutter, stamping machine, etc., compared to a robot. So I think that from a buyer's perspective, from an investor's perspective, you have to approach it very differently. And two, I think the last point really hit the nail on the head. Robots, the more customized the robots are, the harder they are to finance. So I think it's for the company that's buying the robot to really put some thought into how do we not overly customize this machine? Or if we need to overly customize, you're effectively turning that dial between the more customized I need this to be, the less financeable it is. Or the more I can find a way to make sure it's fairly standard, the more financeable it is. A great example was Mike's comment about cobots. They're very flexible, they're easy to program. You don't get a lot of system around the robot. You're essentially buying the robot. So it's very financeable. Whereas if you buy a very bespoke, traditional industrial machine setup, it's going to be heavily customized. It's not going to be very financeable. And it can cause some challenges. And I think any company going in should just go in with that sort of mindset in place to weigh those two options.
Oliver, have you got anything that you'd like to add there?
Yeah. So, going back to the sort of point that Laura made and Troy's made there around sort of the longevity of the contracts that maybe some of these subcontract manufacturers are receiving or bidding on, I would always potentially sort of push back on those that are providing those contracts, those end manufacturers, those that own the brands that these subcontract manufacturers are producing for, to try and increase the length of their contracts. Yeah, if you can see a 1 or 2 year contract that you're bidding on being increased to 3 to 5 years, it's much then easier to go to your finance company to say, well, I've got a 5 year contract now with this company. I want to automate purely to ensure that we meet the costs that we need to meet of what we've won on this contract. Again, going back to the food and beverage, that's the way it happens. You might receive a contract for 1 or 2 years of manufacturing a particular product on a certain line that you own. The trouble is that you can't invest in the automation side of it because it's only a 1 or 2 year contract. Doesn't add up. But maybe going back and being completely transparent with those that are actually contracting you as the subcontract manufacturer allows you to potentially invest in the automation, and it would make it a much more easy business case to sort of go to the finance company with a longer term contract.
So that kind of helps from an end user perspective of the automation, thinking differently and maybe looking at different ways of overcoming these challenges. Is there any way that providers of automation can engage with finance institutions maybe to overcome some of the barriers. So maybe look at how they educate the finance providers in terms of what is flexible and what isn't flexible, what could be repurposed and what couldn't. Is there anything that you could perhaps add on that point, Oliver?
So I think sort of what I would say is that we already work quite closely with finance companies, especially on the machine tool side at FANUC. You know, that's an easier win for us in terms of getting a larger piece of capital equipment that has a higher residual value. Financed, absolutely. Nearly all of our machines are financed, whether it's injection molding machines or vertical machining centers. On the robot side, it's slightly more tricky, but it is coming. And I think what I would say there is probably with a BARA hat on, the British Automation Robotics Association, what will come going forward is effectively recognition of integrators that effectively are doing the right things to de-risk the automation process. Yeah, so when a customer goes to an integrator of robotics and automation, they ask for a particular solution. How does the finance company know that it's a reputable company, they're doing the right things? How have they been audited and given that big tick to say, yes, you're doing the right thing? And that's where Automate UK and BARA, I think, will come along and actually support that going forward. If you can get a number of integrators that are on an approved list, that those finance firms will have that greater confidence in those suppliers to actually deliver the right equipment that's going to meet the customer's needs.
I think just to add to that, sorry, Peter, you know, as funders, we do have asset management teams that aren't bankers. They come from industry backgrounds, and they're the ones that are reviewing the assets, their useful life and that secondhand market. And we'll work with the likes of Oliver and other equipment providers by trying to understand, as we've said, the application of that equipment and you know, its reliability and all of those things. So again, there is work that can be done behind the scenes in terms of having those conversations. And as Oliver said, that continues to evolve as we educate ourselves and get more familiar with the sort of technology that's involved in robotics as it progresses and advances. You know, often it's always been a case of a lot of it's made up of software and technology, so it's understanding the component parts of that, but actually, you know, we're able to get more familiar with those applications, and that's just by collaborating and talking with one another. So I think that's really important to understand, that it isn't just all about the numbers, it is about understanding the assets application as well.
And I guess confidence in the success of the deployment of that is very, very important. And I mean, Mike, maybe you could explain a little bit about some of the things that MTC have done historically to support, like from a business case kind of point of view.
Yeah, no, thank you, Peter. I think I wanted to make a point just before I get into that, if that's okay, because I think it's worth stressing that this is a journey. It's not a kind of one project exercise, and we're already talking about the fact that we need to build relationships and partnerships with the banks, with the equipment providers, and so on. And I think it's also important, we talked about the risk of a particular application and the fact that, you know, as Troy was saying, the more customized it is, the harder it is to finance. But it's also true that the more customized it is, the more technically tricky the project is also. And we would always recommend that people find a relatively simple application to start with, which actually suits the finance story as well. Because if it's technically relatively simple, it's also easier to finance, and that enables a company to get started and then move along that journey, as it were, move up the learning curve and start to build the partnerships with their finance provider and the business. And moving on to what MTC would do, that's the kind of thing that we would always help businesses. We would try and help them identify a relatively simple application that does have benefit. It's not just doing it for the sake of it, but a relatively simple application that gets them moving on that learning curve, and starts to move them forward. And then it's a part of helping them write a specification for what it is they want to buy, and then also helping them identify the right supplier to provide it. But all of that provides comfort to the finance provider as well, that they're going through the appropriate due diligence, as it were, to get a successful solution at the end of the day. And if we can take a company along that journey with the finance provider alongside, everybody is then much more confident that the right things are being done to ensure that you get a successful project at the end, and therefore it's appropriate for the finance provider to support it.
Great, thank you, Mike. Does anyone have anything to add on this point before we perhaps move on to where government can be a bit more supportive in terms of addressing this issue?
Yeah, Peter, I just wanted to expand on Oliver's point earlier on around that sort of return on investment piece, because I think sometimes there's a bit of a gap of information with, you know, business understanding why they need the equipment and how it would be applied. But there's sometimes is less clarity on what that equipment will enable that business to do in terms of that return on investment, and how quickly, I guess, that initial cost outlay can be recouped. And that ties into my point around affordability earlier. So, for example, and excuse my really bad example, but if a business is currently producing sort of 200 widgets in an hour, and then by investing in automation or robotics, they're able to produce 1,000 and require one less operator, you know, what does that actually mean in terms of cost savings and benefits to the bottom line? And I think that's where, again, that collaboration piece can come into play, because where equipment suppliers often translate these specifics for their clients, any analysis or indicators of those cost savings, that increased efficiency, that can help with that return on investment, and therefore help the funder understand both that affordability and the repayment potential. That really helps, as well as obviously giving the business the confidence in making that investment in the first place. So I think, again, you know, there's some great examples of that already happening, but if you're getting that information from your equipment supplier anyway to help you with your decision, then that's the sort of stuff to share with your funder as well, because we can bake that into our funding process and application assessment.
Great, so thank you, Laura. So I'm aware that we've got quite a few questions coming through, which look pretty interesting, that we'll get onto. So what I'll do is I'll move on to the next stage now of the conversation that we have planned, and then we'll get onto the Q&A after. So one of the other areas that we obviously need to look at is making sure that the UK has the right environment for funding. And there's certain things that we believe that maybe the government could play a role in. And I think perhaps, obviously, Fahim, this is something that you're heavily involved in your role at Make UK. So could I sort of ask you, what role do you think government should play in improving access to finance for manufacturers?
Certainly. I mean, we've got a new government now, so perhaps a new chance to maybe do things a little bit differently from the last decade. And I think before we get into kind of the details of access to finance, it has to start with, and of course, we're expecting this, some sort of vision, long-term industrial strategy that sort of sets the agenda and the objectives of what the UK as a nation wants to be in the next 5 to 10 years. Because what that creates is a stable, predictable environment, and also sets the agenda for what businesses might want to invest in. It gets them more involved. And of course, if we, as part of an industrial strategy, say, we want to create a robotics revolution, then that would set the agenda for SMEs and large and medium-sized businesses to think about, okay, now we need to start thinking about how do we kind of get it moving in that direction. Now, of course, the government's role is not to tell the businesses what to do. Their role is to perhaps shape the tax environment and the regulatory environment, create incentives that might push them or nudge them in a certain direction, but the businesses have to ultimately make the choice on what those investments are. And we can look at policies like how we make use of capital allowances, which the previous government made a great decision on, introducing permanent full expensing capital allowances. I think that could go a step further. We know that there are opportunities to expand it onto leasing, and I think that's something that the government should do. because it's not our job to tell a business whether or not they should buy or lease a new piece of equipment. They should know whether or not the best method for owning a robot is whether leasing or buying. One of the things that actually came out from the report, the research that we did, and I think 68% of manufacturers said that they would like to have access to public support finance information on public support in a more centralized environment. Now, that has been tried before. Businesses have also asked for it before, and it hasn't always worked well. There is a central portal and government website now where you can look up grants, but it's a very complicated and complex to use. But I think now with the advancement of technology, the introduction of AI, and the opportunities that exist with digital technologies, I do think that government should have another crack at this to try and get this centralization of information right this time, so that businesses have a one-stop shop to access the information they need. And this way we create the environment that they need to invest, but also we sort of start to tackle the lack of information and the barriers that we've identified earlier on. So there's a lot of areas of government to cover, but we're pretty consistent on the view that the government should not be making those decisions for businesses, but they need to create that environment for them to do it themselves.
And Troy, as an SME that's been through the process of actually adopting automation, did you feel that there was any sort of clear visibility on access to finance from government institutions when you were looking at investing?
We went straight to the private sector for financing, and to traditional banks and asset finance companies. We found that to work pretty well. And my open experience is that I really like the way Fahim put it. The government's there is to set a strategy and facilitate the private sector executing it, not necessarily corralling people to come together, or businesses to come together and to try to keep aiding them in that way. I think what we're really talking about is financing robots can be a bit more challenging, not necessarily, but it can be. But they are financeable. And I think companies that are really committed to doing it and have very good investment cases will find finance. I mean, it's a nice and competitive financing market in the UK. And I'd be hard pressed to say that there were really great business cases for investments in automation or any other sort of investment that couldn't find good financing. So I like the idea of the government just essentially setting the framework to say, here's where we want to head. Here's an industrial strategy we want to take forward. And I know some of the questions talk about that we'll come on to, so that companies can grow and scale and be confident that their investments will continue to be supported by government policy.
Thanks. And when it comes to access to finance, what part of the journey do we think is easier to finance? Is it businesses that are looking to start up? Is it businesses that are scaling? Or is it businesses that have already scaled? Oliver, I guess, as someone that has a wide variety of customers through the UK, do you see any difference in terms of the ease in which people find finance?
Yes, I mean, typically it's the medium in the SME range that would typically, I think, go to look for finance. Purely for the fact that they've probably got the contracts and they've got from my experience, the engagements with those customers that means they do have to scale. The other thing to say is obviously on the previous answer about the fully expensing model, it does rely on you making a profit, and anyone who's a startup business probably isn't making a profit straight away, to better ensure that the full expensing is going to work for you. So it's quite tricky in that respect. I think there will become more and more small companies look for finance. I get that completely, but at the moment it's probably the medium-sized companies that do come to us with financing as an option to pay for their goods. And
I mean, some of the conversations that I've had, it seems to me that people getting access to finance to scale their business is something that's the real challenge. And do we think there's any role that government could play in providing finance, public finance, to support these kind of businesses as they scale from startups to being the future medium-sized enterprises?
I'm happy to comment on that. Or sorry, yeah. Oliver, you go first.
No, you go for it. You go.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think a priority for government first and foremost should be setting a clear industrial strategy or at least framework. And rather than focusing on trying to get the companies that might not exist or tomorrow's future giants to scale, there are quite a lot of good companies already that could scale here. And making sure they have a steady and a kind of a consistent playing field so that they can continue to grow, I think would generate much higher results than the government trying to, say, fund a startup. Because again, there's lots of venture capital money out there. There's good. I know the UK could do with more, and I completely see that. But traditionally, I mean, if there's a really good investment out there, there's going to be private capital that finds a way to put some money in it to support it, rather than the government. So I would say it's probably definitely important, but probably not as important as some other actions the government could take.
Oh, okay. Oliver, did you want to expand on, make a point?
It's kind of what he said in terms of industrial strategy.
I'd like to add one brief point on that after Oliver. That's okay.
Yeah, so I think it's obviously been a big push over the last few years to obviously try and pull the current government, to actually devise that industrial strategy, which will obviously try and push growth. And I think it's just a continued push from certainly manufacturing, and I think it will happen. But it's just a case of when. So yeah, I'm sure Fahim's got a better answer than that, but we'll see.
I think Oliver made a really good point earlier about capital allowances and how the loss-making element is problematic, especially when a business is scaling up. They are less likely, because they're in that sort of growth stage where they're expanding kind of market share and trying to grasp the industry and grow. But I do think that, we have this amazing network of support available already in the UK that I think we just don't take advantage of enough. That is supported by government institutions like the Catapult networks, and we have the High Value Manufacturing Catapult, the Made Smarters of this world, which are, we're hoping will still be rolled out to the rest of the English nations by 2025. And I think, our research showed that manufacturers are still hugely unaware of those support networks. 60% of manufacturers have never heard of Horizon Europe. So if you're thinking about businesses that are highly innovative and looking to invest in R&D, there's clearly something more that the government can do, which doesn't require new funding or creating a new investment vehicle to fund these startups or SMEs. But actually looking at, okay, we already have this mechanism in place. How do we maximize the value of those mechanisms, making it work with maybe perhaps the private sector and getting that involved? And that's kind of targeting businesses at that sort of growth stage. And so this would really, from a message to Labour, is really just thinking about how you're marketing these things to businesses and reaching out to them as widely as possible.
I think that's the point, isn't it, Fahim, that it's such a complex landscape for businesses to access. So there is the support. You can sort of access grants, funding, or just programs as well, like Mike would do through the MTC. But it's how businesses know about those in the first place. And again, I think that's where, all of us on the call today can help signpost what we know and point businesses in the right direction. I think the other thing, just to call out, sort of slightly linked to that, but more from a private sector point of view, is, when it is difficult for businesses that are starting up and looking to scale and grow, because of all the things I talked about, having that track record and that historic performance. But there are lots of tools and support that your lenders will be able to support you with in terms of that education, that skills, that knowledge building, that confidence around having a good business plan, getting ready to access that funding at the right time, and what options are available to you. So again, don't be afraid to ask for help at that stage. And it might not be the immediate check for investing in that equipment that you may need or other areas, but it will get you to that right point to be able to do that. So it's about asking for the help at the different stages of your sort of life cycle of your business, really.
Thanks, Laura. I'm aware that we've got about 15 minutes left, and we've had a few questions come in from the audience. So I think it'd be great to head across to those and get some input from the panel on those. So first of all, first question that I have here is, does the fact that the UK doesn't manufacture very much anymore exaggerate the results of the UK being 27th in the world for number of robots? I mean, I've got my opinions on that. I think if a misconception with regards to the UK not making anything anymore. I believe we're still in the top 10 or 11 manufacturing nations in the world and the 27th in the world in terms of robot adoption. So something doesn't quite add up there. But perhaps, Fahim, you can expand a little bit more on from a Make UK perspective, is actually where we are as a manufacturing nation and how that robot measure is actually quite a damning one.
No, I think, Peter, yeah, thank you. So, recently when the United Nations trade data updated, the UK was ranked as the 12th largest manufacturing nation in the world, not because we got any smaller, because certain countries, namely Mexico and Russia, and Taiwan, because of the semiconductor supply chain, grew substantially between 2021 and 2022. Now, I don't think that, I think it would be misconstrued to think of the UK as not making anything. I mean, we are still about 10% of the UK's GDP, and actually that is very much comparable to some of our competing nations like the US. It's about the same, 10% of their GDP is manufacturing, yet they are not below the top 10 in robotics density. Germany is about actually closer to 20%, but if you look at the other European nations, they're also about 10%. So really the UK kind of sits in a very similar company when it comes to how our manufacturing sector compares to manufacturing sectors in other countries. Where we have started to fall behind is that these countries are investing a little bit more in automation and robotics. Our own quarterly research shows that European manufacturers are much more quickly buying up digital technologies and capital equipment from UK manufacturers. So we have manufacturers who make these things, and that's European businesses that are buying them because they are much more positive and open to invest in these things. And I think that was a point that Oliver made earlier on about international companies that actually seems to be faster to this adoption. So I think, we should avoid maybe perhaps making that mistake of thinking the UK doesn't make anything. The UK is still a manufacturing superpower in that sense, though we are maybe a more specialized focus on kind of the middle range value add aspect, and perhaps that requires a little bit more. I think the points around customization was made earlier, but I think the UK manufacturing sector probably could do with a bit more customization, and how we can balance that with the financial sector. But I think it is a good point, but I think the UK being the only country in the 27th for robots, and then still being a manufacturing superpower is a problem, and that's something that we need to look at.
I completely agree. One of the other questions that has come in is, excuse me, get my questions up here, is around sort of trying to compare us to other manufacturing nations where maybe other manufacturing nations have much bigger businesses that are high volume producers, and the UK has much more SME manufacturers, and maybe there are greater barriers to automation within those. Do you think it's too simplistic to use this measure, Mike? In particular, I think I'll come to you for this one. And do you think the barriers are really that much greater for SMEs as opposed to bigger businesses?
I think it's a fair statement to say that the barriers are probably slightly bigger for SMEs than they are for larger enterprises. And the fact that we have a significant proportion of SMEs within our manufacturing base does potentially mean that we're going to be a bit slower, but I say a bit slower, not a lot slower. And at the moment, we're a lot slower. I think it's fair to look at other countries and look at how other countries are performing. I completely take the point. I think it's mentioned in the question that South Korea may not be a fair comparison. And it's worth saying that the automotive sector has always been a large user of robots, and all countries that have significant automotive sectors have significant numbers of robots. Electronics more recently has become the biggest user of robots, and therefore when you look at places like South Korea with strong automotive, strong electronics, they're going to have a lot of robots. The one that stands out to me is Denmark. So Denmark, which is in the middle of the robot density table, has more than twice as many robots as we do, based on robot density, the number of robots per 10,000 workers. But Denmark doesn't have an electronic sector and it doesn't have an automotive sector. They've put all their robots into food manufacturing, into medical devices, into general kind of engineering. And I think we should be looking at countries like that more closely. Now, I appreciate that the labour rate in Denmark is maybe quite a bit higher than ours. But having said that, you could argue that they can afford to pay that labour rate because they're more productive. And maybe if we were more productive, we could afford to pay a higher labour rate. So I think there are lessons that we can learn from looking at other countries. You do need to be maybe a little bit careful about it, to ensure that we get the right message across. But fundamentally, the key point is, as we said this more than once, we're way outside where we should be in terms of our manufacturing capability. We are the country that's different. And the rest of the world is all headed in one direction, and at the moment we're not. So, I kind of look at it and say, well, if we want manufacturing to be successful in the UK, if we want to be able to bring back the manufacturing that we offshored back in the 80s and the 70s, then we need to change something. And greater adoption of robots and automation is one of the key elements of addressing that. So we do need to change this. And the story in terms of ensuring that the finance side of the equation is addressed properly is a key element in terms of achieving much greater robot and automation adoption.
Okay, thanks, Mike. And we've had another comment around there being a bit of a contradiction with regards to access to finance from robots being more flexible, yet do SMEs really have the ability to kind of be that flexible with their production and their manufacturing? Obviously, the SME piece of this is quite a key thing, and understanding how SMEs can really embrace automation for perhaps smaller production runs is something that's really important. But does anyone have any, perhaps Troy, from your perspective as a smaller manufacturer with maybe not huge high volume production, how do you feel about that sort of challenge?
Yeah, sure. I think, it is a contradiction. That's why I described it as a dial. You have to make trade-offs. But even really large companies, though, could have very, very specific requirements. If you need your robots to do very specific handling and movement of formed parts for an automotive factory, it's going to be very specific. But the gentleman who made that question is absolutely right. And it's just the nature of the challenge. If it's the more customized it is, the more difficult it is to finance. So what I would encourage the companies to look at, and the teams looking at the investment, is there's always some degree of standardization you can put into the system. And really focus and learn that and understand that, so that you can make it as flexible as possible. So say, to Mike's point, you're buying early on, you're buying a robot, you want to start with something simple, but just make sure you're speccing it out so it can do other parts. Or the various components going into it are standard parts, because it's very easy to over customize everything, right? So if you can take customization from a 7 to a 5 on a scale of 1 to 10, you're in a better position. And that's what I would say. And that's the nature of the beast. And then I would also say it's not just down to the business, it's down to the robotics manufacturers, companies like Fanuc, who launched cobots. The more the machines become standard and easy to program and easy to manipulate into different tasks, the more standard they are, irrespective of what the company needs it for.
Okay. Thanks, Troy. Got another question here about, are there any lessons that we can learn from other international markets where they have, successfully, exact question here, but they've successfully overcome financial barriers to automation investment? Does anyone have any information or any points that they can make on that?
Yeah, so I can probably answer that. So from again experience over in Scandinavia, sitting next to Denmark, we've got Sweden, where I was for 5 years. If we look at this sort of two answers to this question, one is around obviously tier supply. So those subcontract manufacturers into the end users, they will certainly look at longer term payback, assuming they can get the contract length in the right place with their end customer. But then for the end users themselves, those that are actually producing goods to export, they will typically commit a lot easier on automation, knowing that they produce a product that will be in the market for at least 3 years. You know, I look at the likes of, say, Husqvarna, who make robotic lawnmowers. Yeah, they start producing, obviously, and automating their production in Sweden. That's now come across into the UK. They've started building their own automation teams in Husqvarna UK to ensure that they've got the right skills and support in their factories locally to make that automation work. So they're really committing to it. So as an end user, they're committing to the automation. This goes across multiple fields as well. We see aerospace companies, we see automotive companies, we see the likes of Amazon, you know, warehouse and logistics companies committing to in-house teams to produce their own or support their own automation needs, you know. For the SME market, the tier suppliers to these, they have to try and keep up. But part of that is obviously accessing finance with those hopefully longer term contracts they can put in place. I know there's a question there around obviously how do food companies secure longer contracts based on changing consumer demand. It's a slightly it's a difficult one. Of course it is, you know, because the products may change, but things like the packaging may not change. And that's where food companies can help support those supply chains in making sure packaging does stay the same. Because at the end of the day, if it's a box of cornflakes or a box of Rice Krispies, if the packaging stays the same size, it can still be palletized using a robot. You know, if we then go from bags to boxes to pallet loads, yeah, it's a slightly different scenario. You know, so by ensuring that the end user or the end consumer knows that they can always buy boxes of Rice Krispies, it's that's the way to go, you know.
So I think we're sort of coming to a close now on the allotted hour that we had for this discussion. I'd just like to go around the room and just find out if anyone has any sort of closing remarks or comments that they want to get across. So Mike, perhaps I'll start with yourself.
I think the key to all of this is to get started. So reach out to people that can help if you're unsure. You know, MTC's there to help. Talk to your local bank. Start to build partnerships. Talk to people. But the key is to start.
Roy?
Was that me, Pete? I couldn't hear.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Yep.
Would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I'll just talk from personal experience from my company. You know, it was very difficult making that first investment. The financing was hard, trying to get our heads around what was customizable, how standard could we make it. It was challenging, which parts would go through. So it is tough, absolutely tough. But what I could say was it helped change the directions of our business. That helped us grow substantially by automating the weld. We focused a lot of our automation so far on the welding side of our business. It's allowed us to compete for larger contracts, and it's allowed us to scale. So I would just add that as a company that did make the leap, I could say that once you do make the leap, if you are going from say 0 to 1, or you've bought 1 or 2 robots, and you're thinking really integrating them into your business, they will help transform your business. And if you're looking to grow a lot, they will help enormously. So it will be tough, but often it's worth the pain.
Thanks, Troy. Laura, would you like to add any final comments?
Yeah, I think just to sort of iterate the points that we made earlier, I think, you know, collaboration is key, and transparency. So, you know, you're not doing this alone, as Troy said, asking the right questions and talking to your key partners, whether that's your equipment supplier, your funders, you know, making sure that you've got all of those options on the table so that you can make an informed decision to go in the right direction is key. And you know, we have talked about, obviously, there are challenges to accessing things when it's more customized, but at the end of the day, there are different ways of looking at things, and it's not an immediate, we've got to rule that out. It will be a case of looking at what the best solution is going forward. So yeah, transparency and collaboration is key, I think.
Great, thanks, Laura. Fahim.
We have like a saying we often use in Make UK, and it doesn't just apply to automation, it's all technology. And technology isn't just for big businesses, it's for all businesses. And I think that's one thing that I would like to see the perception change from the SME perspective. I know we've discussed SMEs a lot today. And it's time to start thinking about automation robotics, not for its costs, but actually for the opportunity it's going to bring to the UK.
Thanks, Fahim. And Oliver, finally.
Yeah, I think some great points made by everyone there, but from my point of view, it would be thinking slightly longer term, thinking about the total business case. And again, similar to Laura, make sure you work with everyone within that, every stakeholder within that decision-making process, whether it's customer or supplier.
Great, thanks, Oliver. So it just remains for me to thank all the panelists for joining us today. I think from our perspective, we know this is the beginning and we must continue the conversations moving forward. And if you'd like more information or to find out more about what else we're doing, go to the UK Automation Forum website. You can contact us via there, and we'd be happy to continue to engage in conversations. This will be recorded and posted on the UK Automation Forum website, so if anyone wants to have a look at it again, feel free to do so. And I'd like to thank everyone for their time and wish you a good afternoon.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Phil.
Thank you.
Bye.